A waitress takes her daughter to work. Suddenly, she runs to a millionaire's table, calling him Dad. A struggling waitress, Naomi, does everything she can to provide for her 5-year-old daughter, Aria. One evening at the diner, as she juggles orders and exhaustion, Aria suddenly dashes across the room, straight to a wealthy businessman's table. "Daddy!" she exclaims, shocking everyone. The man, Julian Montgomery, a powerful CEO, is taken aback. He doesn't know this little girl, or does he? Naomi's heart pounds as she locks eyes with the man she never thought she'd see again, the man who unknowingly changed her life 6 years ago. Could fate have just brought them back together? Or is this reunion about to reopen wounds that were never meant to heal? Before we begin, my beautiful story family, let me take a moment to say something personal. We spend hours making these videos, hoping they reach people worldwide. My goal is to share stories that teach valuable lessons about love, humility, and kindness. I'd love to know where you're watching from, so please drop a comment below and let me know. Also, I appreciate you all for being part of this growing community. Your support means the world to me. Let's begin. The diner buzzed with the clatter of plates and the hum of overlapping voices, a chaotic symphony Naomi had learned to navigate with a forced smile. She wiped her hands on her apron, the faint scent of grease and coffee clinging to her skin, and glanced over at the small table near the counter where Aria sat, swinging her legs. The 5-year-old's crayons rolled lazily across the scratched wooden surface, her tiny fingers smudging red and blue streaks onto a napkin. Naomi's heart tightened. She hated bringing Aria here, but with no babysitter and a double shift ahead, she had no choice. "Baby, stay right here, okay? Mommy has to work," Naomi said, her voice soft but firm, crouching to meet Aria's wide, curious eyes. Aria puffed out her cheeks, her pout dramatic enough to rival a silent film star. "But I'm bored, Mommy. There's nothing to do." Naomi brushed a hand over Aria's braided hair, forcing a chuckle despite the ache in her chest. "I know, sweet girl. Just color me something pretty, all right? I'll be back to check on you soon." She straightened, her knees creaking from hours on her feet, and turned to grab a tray of steaming plates from the kitchen pass-through. The weight of the day pressed down on her, bills piling up, a landlord who didn't care about excuses, and a daughter who deserved so much more than this chipped, noisy diner. Across the room, the lunch rush pulsed with energy. Truck drivers hunched over burgers, a group of college kids laughed too loudly over fries, and at the corner table by the window sat a man who didn't belong. He was polished, too polished, his suit crisp, his watch glinting under the diner's harsh lights. A briefcase rested by his polished shoes, and he sipped his coffee with a quiet intensity, scanning a newspaper like he was searching for something between the lines. Naomi had noticed him the moment he walked in. He tipped well, spoke little, and carried an air of someone who owned the world but didn't flaunt it. She'd pegged him as a businessman passing through, maybe a billionaire on his way to something bigger than this dusty highway stop. "Order up, Naomi," the cook barked from the kitchen, snapping her back to reality. She hustled the tray to a table of regulars, flashing a smile she didn't feel when a blur of motion caught her eye. Aria, her little whirlwind, was off her chair, darting through the maze of tables, her sneakers squeaking against the linoleum. Naomi's stomach dropped. "Aria, get back here," she called, her voice sharp with panic, but the girl didn't stop. She weaved past a waitress balancing a pitcher of iced tea, her braids bouncing, until she skidded to a halt right in front of the businessman's table. Naomi froze, tray still in hand, as Aria's small voice rang out, clear and bright. "Daddy!" The word hit the air like a thunderclap. The diner didn't go silent, not quite, but Naomi felt the shift, the way heads turned, the way conversations stuttered. The businessman lowered his newspaper slowly, his sharp green eyes locking onto Arya with a flicker of something. Surprise, confusion, maybe recognition. Naomi's heart slammed against her ribs. She dropped the tray onto the nearest table, ignoring the clatter, and rushed forward. "Arya, what are you doing?" she hissed, grabbing her daughter's arm. Her face burned with embarrassment as she forced a laugh, glancing at the man. "I'm so sorry, sir. She's got an imagination, you know, kids." The man didn't laugh back. He folded the newspaper with deliberate care, setting it beside his coffee, and leaned forward slightly, studying Arya. "Daddy, huh?" His voice was low, smooth, with an edge that made Naomi's skin prickle. "That's interesting." Arya tilted her head, undeterred, her big brown eyes shining. "You look like him, like in Mommy's picture." Naomi's breath caught. "Picture? What picture?" She yanked Arya closer, her mind racing. "Sweetie, stop it. You're being silly. Let's go back to your table." Her words tumbled out too fast, her smile too tight, but the man's gaze shifted to her now, piercing and unreadable. "Picture?" he repeated, one eyebrow arching. "What's she talking about?" "Nothing," Naomi said quickly, too quickly. "She's 5. She makes things up. I'm really sorry. He's not mad, is he?" She directed the last part at the man, her tone pleading, but his expression didn't soften. "I'm not mad," he said, his eyes still on her, searching. "Curious, maybe." He paused, then added, "She's a cute kid." "What's her name?" "Arya," Naomi answered before she could stop herself, then cursed inwardly. Why was she still standing here? Why wasn't she walking away? But something in his voice, his posture, held her in place. He leaned back in his chair, crossing one leg over the other, and tapped a finger against the rim of his coffee cup. "Arya," he echoed, tasting the name. "Pretty. And you're—" "Naomi." The word slipped out, automatic, and she hated how small it made her feel. She tightened her grip on Arya's hand. "Look, I've got tables to wait. Sorry again for the trouble." She turned to leave, pulling Arya with her, but the girl twisted in her grasp, looking back at the man. "You're coming home with us, right, Daddy?" she chirped, and Naomi's blood ran cold. The man chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that didn't match the intensity in his eyes. "Home, huh? That's a new one." He glanced at Naomi again, and this time there was something sharper in his look, something that made her feel exposed. "You sure she's just making it up?" Naomi didn't answer. She dragged Arya back to the counter, her pulse hammering in her ears. "Sit down," she snapped, plunking her daughter onto the chair. "And don't you move again, you hear me?" Arya's lip trembled, but she nodded, clutching her crayons. Naomi exhaled, trying to steady herself, but her hands shook as she smoothed her apron. What was that? Why had Arya said it? And why did that man, some stranger in a suit, look at her like he knew something she didn't? Behind her, the diner hummed on, oblivious. She risked a glance over her shoulder. The businessman was watching her, his coffee untouched now, his fingers steepled in front of him. He didn't smile, didn't wave, just watched. And for reasons she couldn't name, Naomi felt a knot tighten in her gut, a warning, a question, a thread she couldn't pull without risking everything. The next hour crawled by. Naomi moved through her tables on autopilot, refilling drinks, clearing plates, forcing small talk with customers who didn't notice the storm churning inside her. Every few minutes her eyes darted to Arya, who'd gone quiet, scribbling furiously on her napkin, then to the man who stayed put, nursing that same cup of coffee like he had nowhere else to be. He didn't call her over, didn't make a scene, but his presence loomed heavy and persistent. "Naomi, you okay?" Trish, the other waitress, nudged her as they passed in the narrow aisle. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "I'm fine," Naomi lied, flashing a quick smile. "Just tired." Trish shrugged and moved on, but Naomi wasn't fine. She kept replaying Arya's words. "Daddy, you look like him, like in Mommy's picture?" And they clawed at her. She didn't keep pictures. Not of anyone. Not since. She shook her head, shoving the thought down. It was nonsense. Arya was a kid with a wild imagination, that's all. But then, as the clock ticked toward the end of her shift, the man stood. He left a stack of bills on the table, far more than his coffee warranted, and picked up his briefcase. Naomi watched, holding her breath, as he crossed the diner. He stopped at the counter just a few feet from where Arya sat and leaned down to her level. "Nice meeting you, Arya," he said, his voice warm but laced with something heavier. "You take care of your mom, okay?" Arya beamed, nodding. "Okay, bye, Daddy." Naomi's chest tightened. She opened her mouth to say something, anything, but he straightened, tipped his head at her in a silent farewell, and walked out the door. The bell jingled behind him, and he was gone, swallowed by the glare of the afternoon sun. She stared after him, her mind a tangle of questions. Who was he? Why had he stayed so long? And why did Arya's words, her innocent, impossible words, feel like they'd cracked open a door Naomi had locked years ago? "Mommy, look!" Arya's voice broke through her haze. She held up her napkin, now covered in a messy drawing, a stick figure family, a woman with braids, a little girl, and a man in a suit. "It's us!" Naomi forced a smile, but her throat felt dry. "That's beautiful, baby," she managed, taking the napkin with trembling fingers. She folded it quickly, tucking it into her apron pocket. "Let's get you cleaned up. Shift's almost over." But as she wiped Arya's hands, her thoughts spun. That man wasn't just a stranger. He couldn't be. And Arya's drawing, her words, felt like a key to something Naomi wasn't ready to face. Not yet. Outside, the highway stretched on, endless and indifferent. But inside Naomi, a quiet tension took root, whispering that this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. What would you do if your child ran to a stranger, calling him Dad? Let me know in the comments. Naomi wiped down the counter, her movements mechanical, her mind still reeling from the businessman's exit. The folded napkin with Arya's drawing burned a hole in her apron pocket, and every time she glanced at her daughter, now humming softly as she colored, she felt that knot in her gut tighten. The diner was quieter now, the lunch rush fading into the late afternoon lull, but the air felt thick, heavy with questions she couldn't answer. She told herself it was nothing. Kids said wild things. That man, whoever he was, had left, and that was that. But then the bell above the door jingled again, sharp and insistent, cutting through the low murmur of the diner. Naomi's head snapped up, and her breath hitched. There he was, stepping back inside, his suit still pristine, his briefcase still in hand. The businessman, Julian Montgomery, though she didn't know his name yet, paused just past the threshold, his green eyes sweeping the room until they landed on her. Then on Arya. "Mommy, he's back," Arya chirped, her crayons clattering to the table as she waved at him with both hands. Naomi's heart lurched. She dropped the rag she'd been holding and hurried around the counter, her sneakers squeaking against the floor. "Sir, I'm so sorry about earlier," she said, her voice tight, forcing a smile that felt like it might crack. "She didn't mean to bother you, she's just—" Julian raised a hand, cutting her off, his expression unreadable. "It's fine," he said, his tone clipped but not unkind. He stepped closer, his gaze dropping to Arya, who was now standing on her chair, grinning like she'd just spotted her best friend. "I forgot something." He patted his pockets as if searching for an excuse, but his eyes never left the little girl. "Excuse me, little one," he said, crouching slightly to meet Arya's level, his voice softening in a way that made Naomi's stomach twist. "Do I know you?" Arya giggled, kicking her legs against the chair. Mommy says my daddy is handsome. You look just like my teddy bear dad. Naomi's face flushed hot, a wave of embarrassment crashing over her. Arya, hush, she snapped, grabbing her daughter's arm to pull her down. I'm so sorry, she said again, turning to Julian, her words tumbling out in a rush. She's got this stuffed bear she calls Daddy Bear, and I don't know where she gets these ideas. She didn't mean anything by it. Julian straightened, his lips twitching into something that wasn't quite a smile. Teddy Bear, Dad, he repeated, almost to himself, his tone laced with a mix of amusement and something deeper, something that made Naomi's skin prickle. He studied Arya for a moment longer, then shifted his attention to Naomi, his eyes narrowing slightly. She's quite a character. Yeah, she is, Naomi said, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow even to her own ears. She tugged Arya closer, her hand trembling against her daughter's small shoulder. Look, I've got to get back to work. Thanks for being understanding. She turned to retreat, desperate to put space between them, but Julian's voice stopped her cold. Wait. Naomi froze, her back to him, her pulse thudding in her ears. She didn't want to turn around, didn't want to face whatever was in his tone, curiosity, suspicion, something she couldn't name. But she did, slowly, meeting his gaze. You're Naomi, right? He asked, his head tilting slightly, like he was piecing something together. And she's Arya, she nodded, wary. Yeah. Why? Julian didn't answer right away. He set his briefcase down on the nearest table, the soft thud echoing in the quiet diner, and crossed his arms. I don't know, he admitted, his voice low, almost introspective. There's just something about her. He glanced at Arya again, who was now hugging her knees and watching him with unabashed fascination. She's got a spark, reminds me of someone. Naomi's mouth went dry. She's just a kid, she said, too quickly, her defenses rising. She reminds everyone of someone. Maybe, Julian murmured, but he didn't sound convinced. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a sleek silver pen, and twirled it between his fingers. A nervous habit, maybe, or a way to think. I don't usually come back to places like this, he said, almost to himself. But I couldn't shake it. What she said. It's nothing, Naomi insisted, her voice sharper now, edged with a panic she couldn't fully hide. She's 5. She makes up stories. Julian's eyes flicked to hers, holding her there, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The diner faded, the clink of dishes, the hum of the jukebox, Trish's laughter from the kitchen. All of it blurred into the background. There was just him watching her, and her trying not to flinch. Does she? He asked finally, his tone so quiet it barely carried. Or is there something you're not saying? Naomi's breath caught. She opened her mouth to deny it, to laugh it off, but nothing came out. Because deep down, buried beneath years of exhaustion and carefully built walls, a tiny, treacherous voice whispered, "What if he's right?" Before she could respond, Arya piped up again, oblivious to the tension crackling between the adults. "Mommy, can Daddy Bear come home with us? He's lonely." Julian chuckled, the sound breaking the spell, but his eyes stayed on Naomi, searching. "Lonely, huh?" he said, glancing at Arya. "Well, we wouldn't want that, would we?" Naomi forced a smile, her chest tight. "She's got a big imagination," she said, steering Arya back to her seat. "Thanks again for not being upset. I've got to finish up here." Julian nodded, but he didn't move to leave. Instead, he picked up his briefcase and took a step closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "If there's more to this, any of it, I'd like to know. I don't like loose ends." Her stomach dropped. "There's nothing to know," she said, meeting his gaze with a defiance she didn't feel. "You're a stranger, that's all." He held her stare for a beat longer, then tipped his head in a faint nod. "Fair enough," he said, turning toward the door. Take care, Naomi." The bell jingled as he left, and Naomi exhaled, her knees weak. She sank onto a stool behind the counter, watching Arya scribble again, her little world untouched by the storm brewing in her mother's mind. Julian Montgomery, whoever he was, had walked out, but he'd left something behind, a crack in the life Naomi had built, a question she couldn't ignore. Because as much as she wanted to dismiss it, to bury it, she couldn't shake the feeling that he'd seen something in Arya, something she'd spent years trying to forget. And now, with his parting words echoing in her ears, she wondered, what if he came back? What if he already knew? The diner clock ticked on, marking the minutes of a shift that suddenly felt endless. And outside, Julian Montgomery stood by his car, staring back at the diner through the window, his own thoughts a tangled mess of doubt, memory, and a pull he couldn't explain. Naomi slumped against the counter, her hands still trembling as she watched the door where Julian Montgomery had disappeared for the second time. The diner's hum had returned, plates clinking, a trucker calling for more coffee, but her world felt off-kilter, tilted by his parting words. "I don't like loose ends." She pressed a hand to her chest, trying to steady her racing heart, but Arya's voice broke through her haze. "Mommy, why'd he leave again?" Arya asked. Her crayons paused mid-scribble, her big eyes searching Naomi's face. "He's nice, like Daddy Bear." "He's not." Naomi stopped herself, softening her tone. "He's just a man, baby, a customer. He's gone now, okay? Let's focus on getting home soon." She forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Arya shrugged and went back to her drawing, oblivious to the storm churning inside her mother. Naomi busied herself with wiping down the counter again, her movements jerky, her mind spinning. She wanted to believe it was nothing, Arya's wild imagination, a stranger's curiosity. But Julian's face lingered, sharp and unsettling. Those green eyes, that jawline, the way he carried himself. It tugged at something buried deep, a memory she'd locked away years ago. She shook her head, shoving the thought down. It was impossible, ridiculous. She was tired, that's all. But as the minutes ticked by, the diner emptying out, that locked-away memory began to creak open, unbidden. 6 years ago. A night she'd never told anyone about, not Trish, not her sister, not even herself in the quiet hours when the guilt crept in. She'd been 22, reckless, drowning in a dead-end job and a breakup that left her hollow. She'd gone to a bar on a whim, a rare night out, and there he was, tall, charming, with a smile that promised escape. They talked for hours, laughed over cheap drinks, and then one thing led to another. No names, no numbers, just a fleeting, passionate blur. She'd woken up alone in her apartment, his scent still on her sheets. And that was it. He was gone, a ghost she'd never see again. 9 months later, Arya was born. Naomi's rag stilled on the counter, her breath shallow. She'd never looked for him, didn't even know his name. She'd told herself it didn't matter, that Arya was hers and hers alone. But now, staring at the spot where Julian had stood, she couldn't unsee it. The resemblance. Not exact, not enough to be sure, but enough to make her stomach twist. The eyes, the way he tilted his head, the quiet confidence. Could it be him? The bell jingled again, and Naomi flinched, half expecting Julian to walk back in. But it was just a late customer, a grizzled man in a flannel shirt who grunted a greeting and slid into a booth. She exhaled, shaking her head. "Get it together," she muttered under her breath, tossing the rag into the sink. She crossed to Arya's table, forcing normalcy into her voice. 5 more minutes, sweet girl. Then we're out of here." "Okay, Mommy," Arya chirped, holding up her latest drawing, a messy heart around 3 stick figures. "This is us and Daddy Bear." Naomi's smile faltered, but she nodded, tucking the napkin into her pocket with the others. "Beautiful baby," she said, her voice tight. She turned away, busying herself with the coffee pot, but her mind wouldn't let it go. Julian's question echoed. "Have we met before?" He'd said it softly, almost to himself, as he'd studied her face earlier, right after Arya's second outburst. She'd brushed it off then, her nerves jangling. "I'm sorry, sir," she'd said, her laugh brittle. "My daughter has an active imagination." He'd tilted his head, those green eyes narrowing slightly. "Have we met before?" His tone wasn't accusing, just searching, like he was trying to place her in a puzzle he didn't understand. "No," she'd lied too quickly, her face burning. "I don't think so. I'd remember." She turned away then, dragging Arya back to her seat, but she'd felt his gaze on her, heavy and persistent, until he finally left. Now, alone with her thoughts, Naomi couldn't shake it. What if he did remember? What if he'd felt it too, that flicker of something familiar? She pressed her fingers to her temples, willing the questions away, but they only grew louder. What if he was the man from that night? What if Arya, her bright, impossible girl, wasn't just hers? Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting long streaks of gold across the diner floor. Naomi glanced at the clock. Her shift was over. She untied her apron, her hands unsteady, and called to Trish. "I'm heading out. See you tomorrow." Trish waved from the kitchen. "Get some rest, girl. You look like you need it." Naomi managed a weak laugh, gathering Arya's things. "Yeah, I do." She hoisted Arya onto her hip, the girl's small arms wrapping around her neck, and pushed through the door into the cooling evening air. The highway stretched out before them, endless and quiet, but Naomi's mind was anything but. She strapped Arya into her booster seat in their beat-up sedan, her movements automatic, her thoughts a tangle of doubt and fear. As she slid into the driver's seat, she caught her reflection in the rearview mirror. Worn, wary, a woman carrying too much. She started the engine, pulling onto the road, but a shadow lingered in her periphery. A sleek black car idling across the lot, its tinted windows glinting in the fading light. She told herself it was nothing, just a coincidence, but her grip tightened on the wheel. Miles away, Julian Montgomery sat in the back of that same black car, his jaw tight, his fingers drumming against the leather armrest. The diner shrank in the distance as his driver pulled onto the highway, but his mind stayed there, on the little girl with the fearless grin, on the woman with the guarded eyes. He couldn't place it, couldn't name it, but something about them gnawed at him, a pull he couldn't ignore. "Marcus," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. His assistant, a wiry man in the passenger seat, turned, adjusting his glasses. "Yes, sir?" "Find out everything you can about her," Julian said, his gaze fixed out the window. "Naomi, the waitress, and her daughter." Marcus nodded, already pulling out his phone. "Anything specific you're looking for?" Julian didn't answer right away. He thought of Arya's voice, Daddy, and Naomi's quick denial, the way her hands shook when she pulled the girl away. "Just everything," he said finally. "I need to know who they are." The car sped on, the city skyline rising ahead, but Julian's thoughts were elsewhere, tangled in a past he couldn't quite grasp. And back in her own car, Naomi drove home, the weight of her own past pressing closer with every mile, a collision neither of them saw coming. Do you believe in fate? Could Julian really be Arya's father? Comment your thoughts. Naomi pulled into the cracked driveway of their small apartment, the engine sputtering as it shut off. She sat there for a moment, hands still on the wheel, staring at the peeling paint on the building's facade. Arya's soft snores drifted from the back seat, a rare moment of peace that did little to quiet the storm in Naomi's mind. The black car she'd glimpsed in the diner lot haunted her. Had it followed them? She shook her head, dismissing it as paranoia. Julian was gone. It was over. She unbuckled Aria, carrying her inside with a heaviness she couldn't shake, the questions from that day looping endlessly. Who was he? What did he want? Could he really be? The next morning, she pushed it all down, burying it beneath the routine of getting Aria ready and heading back to the diner. But when she walked through the door, tray in hand, her heart stopped. There he was again, Julian Montgomery, sitting at the same corner table, his suit as sharp as ever, his briefcase by his side. He looked up from his coffee as she entered, his green eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her stomach flip. "Mommy, it's him," Aria squealed, tugging at Naomi's hand before she could stop her. The little girl waved wildly, and Julian's lips curved into a faint, almost reluctant smile. Naomi forced her feet to move, steering Aria toward her usual table near the counter. "Stay here," she said, her voice sharper than intended, then softened it with a quick kiss to Aria's forehead. "I mean it this time, okay?" Aria nodded, already reaching for her crayons, but Naomi's pulse raced as she approached Julian's table. "You're back," she said, aiming for casual but landing somewhere between wary and accusing. She clutched her notepad, pen poised, though he hadn't ordered anything yet. Julian leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly against the table. "Good coffee," he said, lifting his cup as if that explained everything. "Hard to find these days." She didn't buy it. "Right," she said, her tone flat. "What can I get you?" He studied her for a moment, his gaze steady, searching. "Just the coffee for now," he said, then added, almost too casually, "How's Aria today?" Naomi stiffened, her grip tightening on the notepad. "She's fine," she said, clipped. "Same as always." She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her again. "She's a bright kid," he said, softer now, like he was testing something. "You must be proud." "I am," Naomi replied, facing him again, her defenses up. "She's my world." The words carried a warning she didn't bother to hide, back off. But Julian didn't flinch. He just nodded, his expression unreadable, and she walked away, her skin prickling under his stare. Over the next few days, he kept coming back. Every shift, there he was, same table, same coffee, same quiet presence that set her nerves on edge. Sometimes he'd read a newspaper, sometimes he'd just watch the room. But his eyes always found her, and then Aria, lingering in a way that made her chest tighten. He didn't push, didn't ask more questions, but he didn't have to. His being there was enough to keep her on edge, to keep that buried memory from 6 years ago clawing its way to the surface. "Mommy, why's he here all the time?" Aria asked one afternoon, her head tilted as she munched on a fry Naomi had snuck her from the kitchen. "Does he like us?" Naomi forced a laugh, brushing a crumb from Aria's cheek. "He just likes the coffee, baby. That's all." But the lie tasted bitter. She didn't know why he kept coming, but she felt it, something pulling him here, something she couldn't name. And worse, something pulling her back to him, a curiosity she hated herself for. At night, alone in her tiny bedroom while Aria slept, Naomi wrestled with it. She'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying that night 6 years ago. The man's face was a blur now, softened by time, but the feeling, the heat, the connection, stayed sharp. Julian did resemble him in ways she couldn't ignore. The eyes, the voice, the way he moved. But it couldn't be, could it? She'd slammed the thought shut, rolling over to bury her face in the pillow, but it crept back every time she saw him at the diner. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the diner slowed, Julian lingered longer than usual. Naomi was clearing a table nearby when he spoke, his voice low, cutting through the quiet. "You're good with her," he said, nodding toward Aria. who was giggling with Trish near the counter. "She's lucky to have you." Naomi paused, a stack of plates in her arms, and met his gaze. "Thanks," she said, cautious. "I do my best." He nodded, then leaned forward slightly, his tone shifting. "You ever think about where she gets that spark, that fearlessness?" Her breath hitched. "She's a kid," she said, deflecting. "They're all like that." "Not all," he countered, his eyes holding hers. "She's special. You know that." Naomi's throat tightened. She wanted to snap at him, to tell him to leave them alone, but something in his voice, soft, almost wistful, stopped her. "Yeah," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "She is." He didn't push further, just sipped his coffee and let the silence settle. But as she walked away, her heart pounded with a truth she couldn't face. She did wonder where Arya got it. The brightness, the boldness, the way she looked at Julian like she knew him. And every time he showed up, that wonder grew, tangling with a fear she couldn't shake. What if he was the answer? She resisted him, kept her walls high, but the cracks were forming. She'd catch herself watching him, how he smiled at Arya's chatter, how he tipped her more than the meal was worth, how he seemed to fit into their little world despite everything. And in those moments, she'd let herself imagine it. Him, 6 years ago, the father she'd never named. Then she'd shut it down hard because imagining meant hoping, and hoping meant breaking. But Julian kept coming, and Naomi kept wondering, and the tension between them thickened with every glance, every word, every unspoken question hanging in the air. Naomi wiped down the last table of the night, the diner nearly empty save for the faint hum of the jukebox, and Trish counting tips at the counter. Julian had left an hour ago, his usual coffee cup still sitting on the corner table, a crisp $50 bill tucked beneath it. Far too much, as always. She pocketed the money with a mix of gratitude and unease, her mind still buzzing from his latest visit. His words lingered. "She's special, you know that." And the way he'd looked at her, like he was peeling back layers she'd spent years building, left her restless. Arya was already half asleep in her chair, her head resting on her folded arms, crayons scattered around her latest drawing. Naomi sighed, brushing a hand over her daughter's braids, and tried to push Julian out of her thoughts. But he kept creeping back, a shadow she couldn't shake. The next day he was there again, same table, same quiet intensity. She served him coffee, kept her distance, but the routine was wearing thin. Every time he showed up, the questions grew louder. Why was he here? What did he want? And why couldn't she stop wondering if he was more than just a stranger? She resisted, clung to her denial, but the pull was undeniable, a thread tightening between them with every passing day. Across town, Julian sat in his sleek office, the city skyline sprawling beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. Papers littered his desk, but his focus was on the slim file Marcus had just handed him. His assistant stood by, arms crossed, waiting for a reaction. "It's her," Julian said, his voice low, almost disbelieving, as he flipped through the pages. A grainy photo from 6 years ago stared back at him. Naomi, younger, laughing in a dimly lit bar, her hair loose, her eyes bright. Next to her, a man with his face half turned, but it was him. He knew it was him. Chicago, 6 years ago, a business trip. Marcus nodded, adjusting his glasses. The dates line up. You were there for the merger talks, stayed an extra night. She was a bartender at that dive off Michigan Avenue. No record of anything after that, though. She disappeared from the grid until she popped up here with the kid. Julian's jaw tightened, his fingers tracing the edge of the photo. Arya, he murmured, the name heavy on his tongue. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, memories flickering to life. That night, a rare break from the grind, a bar he'd stumbled into on a whim. She'd caught his eye immediately, warm, sharp, a spark that cut through the haze of his world. They'd talked, flirted, and then more. He'd left before dawn, no goodbyes, no promises, just a moment he'd buried under years of deals and deadlines. She didn't know who I was, he said, piecing it together. I didn't give her my real name. Marcus raised an eyebrow. You didn't? Julian shook his head, a faint, bitter smile tugging at his lips. Back then, I was careful. Used an alias on trips like that. James Carter. Kept things simple, no attachments. He paused, the weight of it sinking in. She never knew. And the kid? Marcus pressed, leaning forward. You think? I don't know, Julian cut in, his voice sharp, then softened. But the timing, it fits. Too well. He flipped to another page. Naomi's employment records, a birth certificate for Arya, born 9 months after that night. No father listed. His chest tightened, a mix of shock and something he couldn't name. Guilt, maybe, or longing. He'd spent weeks at the diner, drawn to them without knowing why, but now it clicked. Arya's eyes, his eyes, her fearlessness, her grin. And Naomi, God, Naomi, every glance, every guarded word made sense now. She didn't know him, not really, but he'd left a mark she'd carried alone for 6 years. What do you want to do? Marcus asked, breaking the silence. Julian didn't answer right away. He stood, crossing to the window, staring out at the city he'd conquered. I need to see her again, he said finally, his voice steady but laced with something raw. I need to know for sure. Back at the diner, Naomi felt the shift before she saw him. The bell jingled and there he was, stepping inside with a purpose she hadn't seen before. His suit was crisp, his posture tense, and when his eyes met hers, they carried a weight that made her freeze. Coffee? She asked, her voice betraying her nerves as she approached his table. Not today, he said, his tone different, direct, unguarded. He set his briefcase down but didn't sit. Naomi, we need to talk. Her stomach dropped. About what? She said, crossing her arms, a shield against whatever was coming. He hesitated, then stepped closer, lowering his voice. About 6 years ago, Chicago, a bar off Michigan Avenue. Her breath caught, the world tilting beneath her feet. She stared at him, his face suddenly sharper, more familiar, the pieces snapping into place. What are you saying? She whispered, her voice trembling. I'm saying, he said, his eyes locked on hers. I was there. And I think you were too. Naomi's hands shook as she gripped the edge of the counter, Julian's words echoing in her ears. I was there. And I think you were too. The diner blurred around her, the clatter of dishes and hum of voices fading into a dull roar. She stared at him, his green eyes steady and piercing, and felt the ground shift beneath her. Chicago, 6 years ago. That night. It wasn't just a hunch anymore. He knew. Or at least he suspected. Her chest tightened, panic clawing its way up her throat, but she forced herself to breathe, to hold his gaze. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, her voice brittle, a lie she didn't even believe herself. She turned away, grabbing a rag to wipe the already clean counter, anything to avoid those eyes that saw too much. Julian didn't move, didn't let her escape that easily. Naomi, he said, softer now but firm, I'm not here to cause trouble. I need to understand. She didn't respond, her hands moving faster, scrubbing at nothing. Arya's laughter floated from the corner where she sat with Trish, coloring, and Naomi's heart twisted. She wanted him gone, out of her diner, out of her life, before he uprooted everything she'd built. But he stayed, his presence a quiet storm she couldn't outrun. The rest of her shift passed in a haze. Julian lingered, sipping water instead of coffee, watching her with that same intensity. When the clock finally hit closing time, Naomi sent Trish home and started locking up, Arya dozing in her chair. She thought he'd leave, hoped he would, but as she flipped the open sign to closed, he stood, crossing the room to her. "Naomi," he said again, his voice low, urgent. Did we share something 6 years ago?" The question hung between them, heavy and unavoidable. She froze, keys dangling in her hand, the air thick with everything she'd buried. Her mind raced. Chicago, the bar, the stranger who'd slipped out of her life as quickly as he'd entered it. James, he'd called himself. Not Julian, but the face, the voice. It was him. She knew it now, deep in her bones, and the realization hit her like a punch. She turned to face him, her throat dry. "Why are you asking this?" she said, dodging, her voice barely steady. "What does it matter now?" "It matters," he said, stepping closer, his eyes searching hers. "Because I've been digging, Naomi. I found records. Me in Chicago, you working that bar. And the timing..." He paused, glancing toward Arya, then back at her. "It lines up." Her stomach dropped, the world narrowing to his words, to the implication she couldn't ignore. He knew. Maybe not everything, but enough. She crossed her arms, a flimsy shield, and forced herself to meet his gaze. "You're chasing ghosts," she said, her tone sharp. "It was a long time ago. Whatever happened, it's done." "Is it?" He pressed, his voice softening, almost pleading. "Because I look at her, at Arya, and I see..." He stopped, running a hand through his hair, frustration etching his features. "I see something I can't explain, and I think you do too." Naomi's breath hitched, her eyes darting to Arya, still asleep, her small chest rising and falling. The truth clawed at her, desperate to spill out. Yes, they'd shared that night. Yes, Arya was his. But fear clamped it down. If she told him, what then? Would he take Arya away? Would he upend their life with his money, his power? Or worse, would he walk away again, leaving her to pick up the pieces of a hope she'd never meant to let in? "I don't owe you anything," she said finally, her voice trembling but firm. "You come in here, asking questions, stirring things up. But this is my life. Mine and hers, not yours." Julian flinched just barely, but didn't back down. "I'm not trying to take anything from you," he said, his tone raw. "I just want the truth. If there's a chance, if she's..." He stopped, swallowing hard, and the vulnerability in his eyes cracked something in her. She turned away, blinking back the sting in her eyes. "I need to close up," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, just go." He didn't move for a moment, the silence stretching taut between them. Then, with a slow nod, he grabbed his briefcase and headed for the door. "I'll be back," he said, pausing with his hand on the handle. "Not to push, just... I can't walk away from this, Naomi. Not now." The bell jingled as he left, and Naomi sank onto a stool, her knees weak. She stared at Arya, her little girl, her everything, and felt the weight of her dilemma crash down. Tell him, and risk losing control of the life she'd fought for. Keep silent and live with the gnawing doubt, the what-ifs that would haunt her every time he walked through that door. She pressed her hands to her face, torn between protecting her daughter and facing a past that refused to stay buried. Naomi stood behind the counter, the diner's fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead as she watched Julian leave, his parting words, "I can't walk away from this," ringing in her ears. The door swung shut, the bells jingled fading into silence, and she pressed her palms against the cool surface, steadying herself. Arya's soft snores drifted from the corner, a tether to the life she'd built, but her mind was a storm of doubt and fear. She'd pushed him away, clung to her walls, but they were crumbling, and the truth she'd buried for 6 years clawed its way closer to the surface. She locked up, carried Arya to the car, and drove home in a daze, the weight of her choice pressing down. Tell him, and risk everything. Stay silent and let the questions fester. The next morning, Julian was back. He didn't mention their confrontation, didn't push, just ordered coffee and sat at his usual table, his presence steady and unshakable. Naomi served him, her hands trembling slightly, and he caught her eye with a quiet, "Morning." She nodded, retreating quickly, but the air between them had shifted, charged, fragile, like a thread stretched too tight. Arya noticed him too, waving from her spot near the counter, and Julian waved back, a small smile breaking through his guarded expression. Days turned into weeks, and Julian's visits became a rhythm Naomi couldn't escape. He'd show up mid-shift, sometimes with a book, sometimes just his coffee, but always with a quiet attention that drew her in, despite herself. Arya, fearless as ever, started seeking him out. One afternoon, she darted to his table with a drawing, a messy sketch of a man in a suit, a little girl, and a woman with braids. "This is us," she declared, beaming. Julian took the paper, his fingers brushing the edges carefully. "It's perfect," he said, his voice warm, and when he looked up at Naomi, watching from across the room, there was something raw in his eyes. Hope, maybe, or longing. She turned away, her heart pounding, but the image lingered. Him with Arya, a bond forming she couldn't stop. He started lingering longer, timing his visits to the end of her shifts. One evening, as she swept the floor, Arya asleep in a booth, he approached, hesitant. "Can I help?" he asked, gesturing to the broom. She laughed, sharp and surprised. "You, sweep? In that suit?" "I've done worse," he said, a faint grin tugging at his lips. He took the broom from her, their hands brushing, and the contact sent a jolt through her, small, electric, a memory of a night she'd tried to forget. She pulled back, flustered, but he just swept, awkward but earnest, and something in her softened. They fell into a pattern, closing up together, small talk turning into longer conversations. He'd ask about Arya's day, her favorite colors, her endless stories, and Naomi found herself answering, drawn into his quiet curiosity. One night, as they stacked chairs, he said, "She's incredible, you know." "The way she sees the world." Naomi paused, a chair halfway lifted. "Yeah," she said softly. "She is." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the diner faded. Just them, the air thick with unspoken things. She broke away first, her cheeks warm, but the spark was there, flickering back to life. Julian started bringing little gifts for Arya, a coloring book, a stuffed bear with a bow tie. "Looks like Daddy Bear," Arya giggled, hugging it, and Naomi's chest tightened, torn between warmth and dread. She watched them together, Julian crouching to her level, listening to her chatter, his laugh low and genuine, and it stirred something dangerous. A longing she hadn't felt in years, but with it came fear, sharp and familiar. She'd been hurt before, abandoned, left to pick up the pieces. Could she trust him? Could she let him in? One rainy afternoon, the diner slow, Julian sat with Arya while Naomi cleared tables. She caught them mid-story. Arya perched on his knee, waving her arms as she described a dragon she'd fought in her dreams. Julian nodded solemnly, playing along, and when Naomi passed by, their shoulders brushed. He looked up, his hand steadying Arya, and their gazes locked, a beat too long. Her breath caught, old sparks flaring, and she hurried away, her heart racing. That night, as they locked up, rain pattering against the windows, Julian lingered by the door. "Naomi," he said, his voice low, "I don't know what this is, what we're doing, but I'm here, for her, for whatever this could be." She froze, keys in hand, the words sinking in. "I don't know if I can do this," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "I've been alone a long time. It's safer that way." He stepped closer, not touching, but close enough she felt his warmth. "I get that," he said, "but I'm not going anywhere, not this time." The promise hung there, heavy, And when he left, she stood in the quiet, torn between running and reaching back. The next day, everything shifted. Naomi was mid-shift, pouring coffee, when the bell jingled and a man walked in, tall, lean, with a scruffy beard and a swagger she hadn't seen in years. Her stomach dropped. Derek, her ex, the one who'd walked out when she told him she was pregnant, leaving her with nothing but a broken lease and a shattered heart. "Naomi," he drawled, leaning against the counter, his grin too wide. "Been a while." She set the coffee pot down, her hands steady despite the fury boiling inside. "What are you doing here?" she said, her voice ice. "Came to see my girl," he said, nodding toward Arya, who was coloring, oblivious. "Heard you've been raising her alone. Figured it's time I stepped up." Naomi's blood ran cold. "You don't get to step up," she snapped. "You left. You don't get to waltz back in now." Derek's grin faded, his eyes narrowing. "She's mine too, Naomi. I've got rights." "She's not yours," she said, stepping between him and Arya's table. "You gave that up 6 years ago." He straightened, his voice rising. "I'm her father. You can't keep me from her." The diner went quiet, heads turning, and then Julian was there, rising from his table, his presence a sudden wall. "She said no," he said, his tone calm but steel-edged, stepping beside Naomi. "You don't belong here." Derek sized him up, sneering. "Who the hell are you?" "Someone who's not letting you near her," Julian said, nodding toward Arya, who'd looked up, confused. "You're not taking her. Not while I'm here." Naomi's breath caught, gratitude and fear tangling inside her. Derek laughed sharp and mean. "This your new guy, Naomi? Think he can play daddy?" "Get out," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "Now." Derek hesitated, glaring between them, then spat on the floor and stormed out, the bell clanging behind him. Naomi exhaled, her knees weak, and Julian's hand brushed her arm, steadying her. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft. She nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, thanks." He didn't push, just stayed close as she gathered Arya, the little girl clinging to her leg. "Who was that, Mommy?" Arya asked, her eyes wide. "No one, baby," Naomi said, forcing a smile. "Just someone who got lost." But as they locked up that night, Julian lingered again, his protective stance unshaken. "He'll be back," he said, matter of fact. "I'll be here when he is." Naomi met his gaze, the fear still there, but something else too, trust, tentative and new. "Why?" she asked, her voice small. "Why are you doing this?" He stepped closer, his hand lifting, then dropping. "Because I walked away once," he said. "I won't again. Not from her, not from you." The rain fell harder outside, and Naomi felt the old sparks reignite, brighter now, pulling her toward him despite every instinct screaming to pull back. Derek's return had cracked her world open, but Julian's stand had shifted it, and as they stood there, the diner quiet around them, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, she could let him in. The weeks that followed were a dance of closeness and caution. Julian became a fixture, not just at the diner, but in their lives. He'd pick Arya up from preschool when Naomi's shifts ran late, bringing her back with stories of playground adventures. He'd sit with her at the counter, helping with her drawings, his laugh blending with hers in a way that made Naomi's heart ache. She watched them, the bond growing, undeniable, natural, and it terrified her as much as it warmed her. Their own moments grew too. A brush of hands as they passed in the diner's narrow aisle, a shared look over Arya's head that lingered too long. One night, as they closed up, he caught her wrist gently, stopping her mid-step. "Naomi," he said, his voice low, "I don't know how to do this right, but I want to try. With you." She pulled back, but not far, her pulse racing. "I'm scared," she admitted, the words spilling out. I've been hurt before. I can't. I know, he said, his hand falling away but his eyes steady. I won't hurt you. I swear it. She wanted to believe him, felt herself tipping toward him, but Derek's shadow loomed. He'd been quiet since that day, but she knew him, knew he wouldn't let it go. And when he did come back, it was worse than she'd feared. It was a quiet Tuesday, the diner half full, when Derek stormed in, this time with a lawyer in tow, a slick man in a cheap suit clutching a folder. Naomi, Derek said, loud enough to turn heads. We're doing this legal. I want custody. She's mine. Naomi's heart stopped, her hands dropping the tray she'd been holding, plates crashing to the floor. You can't, she said, her voice breaking. You don't even know her. I've got rights, he shot back, the lawyer stepping forward with papers. DNA doesn't lie. Julian was there in an instant, placing himself between them, his voice low and dangerous. You're not taking her, he said, his eyes locked on Derek. Not while I'm here. Derek laughed, but it was shaky. You think you can stop this? You're nothing to her. Maybe not, Julian said, his tone unwavering, but I'm here. You're not. Naomi's vision blurred with tears, fear and fury warring inside her. She grabbed Arya, pulling her close, and faced Derek. You abandoned us, she said, her voice rising. You don't get to come back now and take her. The lawyer cleared his throat, holding out the papers. We'll let the courts decide, he said, smug. We've filed for a paternity test. The words hit like a blow, and Naomi stumbled back, Julian's arm steadying her. We'll fight it, he whispered, fierce. I've got people, lawyers, resources. He won't win. She nodded, clinging to his promise, but the fear didn't fade. As Derek and his lawyer left, the diner buzzing with whispers, Julian pulled her aside, his hands framing her face. I'm not letting him take her, he said, his voice raw. Or you. I'm in this, Naomi. All the way. She broke then, tears spilling as she leaned into him, the walls she'd built collapsing. I don't know how to trust this, she whispered, but I want to. Then let me show you, he said, his forehead resting against hers, and in that moment the old sparks flared into something deeper. Love, fragile but real, taking root amid the chaos. The fight wasn't over. Derek's threat hung heavy, a storm waiting to break. But as Julian held her, Arya safe between them, Naomi felt a shift. She wasn't alone anymore. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to face whatever came next. Naomi clung to Julian in the dim light of the diner, the echoes of Derek's threat still ringing in her ears. His hands framed her face, steady and warm, and for the first time in years, she let herself lean into someone, into him. Arya nestled between them, her small arms wrapped around Naomi's leg, and the weight of the moment pressed down. A family, fragile and untested, forged in the chaos of a fight she hadn't seen coming. Julian's promise, I'm in this, all the way, lingered. A lifeline she wanted to grab, even as fear whispered she'd fall again. They locked up in silence, the rain a soft drum against the windows, and when he walked her to her car, his hand brushed hers, a quiet question she didn't answer. Not yet. The days that followed were a tightrope walk of tension and tenderness. Derek's legal threat loomed, a shadow over every shift, but Julian was there, unwavering, a shield against the storm. He'd show up with his lawyer's assurances, his quiet strength, and Naomi felt the pull grow stronger. Their moments deepened, his hand lingering on her arm as they passed in the diner, a shared smile over Arya's chatter that warmed her to her core. She fought it, the fear of being hurt again, a constant ache. But every time he stayed, every time he stood by her, that fear cracked a little more. One evening, the diner closed early for a broken pipe, and Julian offered to drive them home. Arya fell asleep in the back seat, her stuffed bear clutched tight, and the car ride was quiet, the hum of the engine filling the space between them. At her apartment, Naomi hesitated, keys in hand. "You don't have to go," she said, her voice small, a leap she hadn't planned. He looked at her, surprise flickering in his green eyes, then nodded. "Okay," he said simply, following her inside. The apartment was cramped, lived in, crayon marks on the walls, a couch sagging under years of use. But he didn't seem to notice. She put Arya to bed, the girl's soft snores a comfort, and when she returned, Julian stood by the window, staring out at the rain-slicked street. "You're good at this," he said, turning to her, his voice low. "Being her mom. Being everything." She shrugged, wrapping her arms around herself. "I try. It's all I've got." But his gaze held hers, steady and searching, and the air shifted, charged, alive with something she couldn't name. He stepped closer, slow, giving her space to pull away. She didn't. "Naomi," he said, his hand lifting to brush her cheek. "I've been running from this, us, for weeks, maybe longer, but I can't anymore." Her breath caught, the warmth of his touch unraveling her defenses. "Julian," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm scared. I don't know how to do this again." "Then we'll figure it out," he said, his forehead resting against hers. "Together." The kiss came then, tentative at first, a question answered with a soft press of lips. Then deeper, urgent, years of longing spilling out. Her hands found his chest, his arms pulling her close, and the world narrowed to them. Rain outside, heat inside, a connection sealed in the quiet of her small living room. They stumbled to the couch, clothes shed in a rush of need, and when they made love, it was raw, passionate, a reclaiming of something lost 6 years ago. She clung to him, her nails digging into his back, and he whispered her name like a prayer, their bodies moving as one. After, tangled in a blanket, she rested against his chest, his heartbeat steady beneath her ear. "I've never stopped thinking about that night," she whispered, the confession slipping out, vulnerable and true. "In Chicago, even when I didn't know it was you." He stilled, his hand pausing in her hair. "Neither have I," he said, his voice rough. "I didn't know what I'd left behind. Not until now." She looked up at him, tears pricking her eyes, and saw the truth in his face. Love, regret, a promise she wanted to believe. They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other, the rain a soft lullaby. And for the first time in years, Naomi felt whole. But Julian couldn't let it rest. The next morning, as she slept, he slipped out, a plan forming. He'd felt it, the certainty that Arya was his, not just in his heart, but in fact. He called Marcus from his car, voice low. "I need a DNA test. Discreet. Use Arya's cup from the diner. There's got to be something left." Marcus hesitated. "You sure about this, boss? If Naomi finds out..." "She won't," Julian said, firm. "Not yet. I need to know." Days passed, the test a secret he carried as he grew closer to them. He'd play with Arya, teach her card tricks, his laugh blending with hers, and Naomi watched, her heart swelling even as doubt lingered. She'd catch him staring at Arya, a question in his eyes, and wonder if he suspected, if he'd push again. But he didn't. Not yet. And she let herself fall deeper, their nights filled with quiet talks and stolen kisses, love blooming amid the uncertainty. Then the results came. Julian sat in his office, the envelope trembling in his hands. He tore it open, scanned the page, 99.9% match. Arya was his daughter. The air left his lungs, a mix of joy and fury crashing through him. She'd known or suspected and kept it from him. Why? That night he went to the diner, waiting until closing. Naomi locked up, Arya asleep in a booth, and he faced her, the paper burning a hole in his pocket. "Naomi," he said, his voice tight, We need to talk." She turned, sensing the shift, her smile fading. "What's wrong?" He pulled out the results, holding them out. "Why didn't you tell me?" Her eyes widened, darting to the paper, then back to him. "What is that?" she asked, though she knew, her voice shaking. "A DNA test," he said, stepping closer. "Arya's mine. You knew, didn't you? Why didn't you tell me?" She stumbled back, tears welling. I didn't know for sure," she said, her voice breaking. "Not until you started coming around, asking questions. And then, I was scared, Julian. Scared you wouldn't want us." He stared at her, the hurt raw in his eyes. "Scared I wouldn't want you?" he repeated, incredulous. "Naomi, I've been here, fighting for you, for her, every day. How could you think that?" "Because everyone leaves," she cried, tears spilling over. "Derek left. You left that night in Chicago. I couldn't risk it again. Not with her." She sank onto a stool, hands covering her face, sobs shaking her shoulders. "I wanted to tell you, I did. But every time I tried, I saw her losing you, and I couldn't." He crossed to her, kneeling, pulling her hands away. "I'm not leaving," he said, fierce and steady. "Not then, not now. She's mine, ours, and I want this. You, her, all of it." She looked at him, tears streaming, and saw the truth. Love, unshaken, even in his anger. "I'm sorry," she whispered, reaching for him. "I should have told you. I was so scared." He pulled her into his arms, holding tight. "I get it," he said, his voice softening. "But no more secrets. We do this together now." She nodded against his chest, the weight lifting, replaced by a fragile hope. They stayed like that, the diner quiet around them, Arya's soft breathing a reminder of what they'd built, what they could still build. The passion of that night, the truth of the test, had sealed them, and as they faced the future, Derek's fight, their new love, they knew it wouldn't be easy, but it would be theirs. The weeks after were a whirlwind. Julian moved closer, renting a place near the diner, his life shifting to fit theirs. He'd pick Arya up from preschool, cook dinner in Naomi's tiny kitchen, his presence a steady hum of comfort. They'd steal moments, kisses in the hallway, hands brushing as they washed dishes, love deepening with every touch. Naomi let her walls fall, piece by piece, trusting him with her heart, with Arya's, and he proved it daily, his determination a quiet fire. Derek's legal battle loomed, but Julian's lawyers were relentless, digging into Derek's past, abandonment, unpaid debts, building a case to bury him. Naomi watched, torn between relief and guilt, but Julian's hand in hers kept her steady. "He doesn't get to win," he'd say, and she believed him. One night, as Arya slept, they sat on the couch, her head on his shoulder. "I still can't believe it," she said, tracing his hand. "You're hers, really hers." He kissed her forehead, soft and sure. "And yours," he said, "always was, even when I didn't know it." The truth had freed them, bound them, and as they lay together, the future stretched out, messy, uncertain, but theirs to face. Derek's shadow lingered, but with Julian beside her, Naomi felt ready. The passion and truth of their connection, a light against the dark. Should Naomi have told Julian earlier? Let's discuss. Naomi leaned against Julian in the quiet of their new home, the glow of the fireplace casting soft shadows across the room. Arya slept between them, her small chest rising and falling, her stuffed bear tucked under her arm. The ring on Naomi's finger caught the light, a constant reminder of the proposal that had shifted their world. Julian on one knee, his voice steady with love, Arya's giggles urging her to say yes. Derek's arrest had faded into a distant echo, his threats silenced by a courtroom, and Julian's unwavering resolve. They'd won, against all odds, and yet Naomi felt the weight of it still. Years of guarding her heart, now open, vulnerable, and full. She traced Julian's hand, his warmth grounding her, and let herself believe in the happy ending unfolding around them. The weeks after Derek's conviction were a slow unraveling of tension, a reclaiming of peace. Julian had insisted on moving them out of her cramped apartment into a house, a 2-story fixer-upper on the edge of town, with a sagging porch and a yard overgrown with wildflowers. "It's not a mansion," he'd said, grinning as he handed her the keys, "but it's ours." She'd laughed, overwhelmed, and Arya had raced inside, claiming a room with a window overlooking an oak tree she swore she'd climb someday. They settled in, painting walls a soft blue, hanging Arya's drawings in mismatched frames. Julian traded his suits for jeans and a tool belt, hammering nails with a focus that made Naomi smile. Here was a man who'd built empires, now building a home. She'd catch him sanding a banister or wrestling with a leaky faucet, sweat on his brow, and feel a rush of something deeper than love, trust, hard-won and precious. Arya trailed him, her helper handing him screws or chattering about her day, and Naomi watched, her heart swelling at the family they'd become. But peace didn't erase the past. Naomi still woke some nights, her breath short, dreaming of Derek's knife, his voice snarling through the diner. Julian would pull her close, whispering, "He's gone. You're safe," until the panic ebbed. She'd nod, clinging to him, and wonder if she'd ever fully let go of the fear. Or if it was part of her now, a scar that shaped her strength. Julian felt it too, though he hid it better. He'd check the locks twice, glance over his shoulder when they walked Arya to school, his protective streak sharpened by Derek's last stand. "I won't let anything touch you," he'd say, his voice low, and she believed him, even as she saw the toll it took, the late nights on the phone with his lawyers, ensuring Derek's sentence stuck. The quiet moments he'd stare at Arya like he was memorizing her, afraid she could slip away. One crisp morning, as leaves crunched underfoot, Julian surprised them. "Get dressed," he said, a glint in his eye, tossing Arya a coat. "We're going somewhere." Naomi raised an eyebrow, but he just grinned, ushering them into his car, a sleek thing he rarely drove now, preferring the beat-up truck he'd bought for hauling lumber. They wound through town, past the diner, until the road opened to a park, its trees ablaze with autumn gold. He led them to a clearing, a picnic blanket spread under an oak, a basket overflowing with sandwiches, fruit, and Arya's favorite cookies. "What's this?" Naomi asked, laughing as Arya dove for the sweets. "A day off," he said, pulling her down beside him. "No work, no worries, just us." Arya ran off to chase leaves, her laughter ringing, and Julian wrapped an arm around Naomi, his warmth chasing the chill. They ate, talked, watched Arya build a leaf pile, and for hours the world shrank to this. Simple, perfect, a moment Naomi tucked away like a treasure. But Julian had more planned. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky pink, he stood, brushing crumbs from his jeans. "One more thing," he said, his voice catching slightly. He called Arya over, her cheeks flushed from running, and took Naomi's hand, leading them to a gazebo strung with fairy lights, glowing soft against the dusk. She frowned, confused, until he stopped, turning to face her. "Naomi," he said, his green eyes steady, "I asked you to marry me once, and you said yes. But I want to do it right. Here, with her." He dropped to one knee, pulling a box from his pocket. Not the ring she already wore, but a smaller one, a delicate band with a tiny star-shaped stone. Arya gasped, clapping her hands, and Naomi's breath hitched as he looked up at her. "Marry me, Naomi," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Let's be a family, for real, forever. You and me and this little tornado." He nodded at Arya, who giggled, bouncing on her toes. "Say yes, Mommy," Arya chirped, tugging at her sleeve, her eyes wide with delight. Naomi laughed, tears spilling over, the weight of his words sinking in. This wasn't just a proposal, it was a vow, a grand gesture to prove he was all in, not just for her, but for Arya, for the life they'd stitched together. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, Julian." He slid the new ring onto her finger, a promise beside the first, and stood, pulling her into his arms. Arya wedged between them, hugging their legs, and the park faded. Just them, wrapped in light and love, the cheers of a few stray picnickers, a distant hum. They stayed there, swaying together, until Arya yawned, the day catching up. Back home, Naomi tucked her in, kissing her forehead. "You happy, baby?" she asked, brushing a braid from her face. "Uh-huh," Arya mumbled, sleepy. "We're a real family now." Naomi's throat tightened and she nodded, slipping out to find Julian on the porch, staring at the stars. "She's right," he said as she joined him, his arm sliding around her. "We are." She leaned into him, the night cool against her skin. "I didn't think I'd get this," she admitted, her voice soft. "Not after everything." "You deserve it," he said, turning her to face him. "We all do." He kissed her, slow and deep, and she felt it. Home, solid and sure, a future she could hold. But happiness, Naomi knew, was never simple. The next day, as she prepped for her shift, the phone rang, a number she didn't recognize. She answered, wary, and a voice she'd hoped to forget slithered through. "Naomi," Derek said, his tone sharp despite the static of a prison line. "You think it's over? I've got people. I'll get her back." Her blood ran cold, the receiver trembling in her hand. "You're done, Derek," she said, forcing steel into her voice. "Stay away from us." He laughed, bitter and jagged. "We'll see," he said, and the line clicked dead. She stood frozen, the kitchen silent, until Julian walked in, his smile fading at her expression. "What's wrong?" he asked, crossing to her. She told him, her voice shaking, and his jaw tightened, fury flashing in his eyes. "He's bluffing," he said, pulling her close. "He's got nothing left, but I'll make sure." He called his lawyers, then a private security firm, his voice clipped and commanding. Within hours, guards were posted, discreet but there, watching the house, the diner, Arya's school. "No chances," he told her, his hand on her shoulder. "He doesn't touch you." She nodded, grateful but rattled, the peace they'd built trembling under Derek's shadow. Julian saw it, pulling her to the couch. "He's not winning this," he said, fierce. "I've got you, both of you." The next week was tense, every jingle of the diner bell making her flinch. Julian stayed close, his presence a shield, and Arya, oblivious, chattered about wedding plans. Flowers, a dress, a cake with stars. Naomi clung to her joy, letting it anchor her, but the fear lingered, a whisper she couldn't silence. Then one stormy night it broke. Naomi was closing the diner, rain hammering the roof, when the door crashed open. A man stood there, not Derek, but rough, tattooed, his eyes hard. "Where's the kid?" he growled, stepping inside, water pooling at his feet. Naomi's heart stopped, her hand gripping the counter. "Get out," she said, her voice steady despite the panic clawing her chest. Arya was with Trish in the back, safe for now, but this man, Derek's people, was real, a threat she'd hoped was empty. Before he could move, Julian was there, shoving through the kitchen door, his stance rigid. "You're done," he said, voice low and lethal, advancing. The man swung, a fist aimed at Julian's jaw, but he dodged, grabbing the arm and twisting it behind the man's back. They grappled, chairs toppling, until Julian pinned him, knee to his spine. "Call the cops," he barked, and Naomi fumbled for her phone, hands shaking as she dialed. The man cursed, thrashing, but Julian held firm, his strength unyielding. Police swarmed in minutes later, cuffing the intruder, and Naomi sank against the counter, Arya running to her, wide-eyed. "Mommy, what happened?" she asked, clinging tight. "Nothing, baby," Naomi lied, stroking her hair. "Just a bad guy who's gone now." Julian joined them, breathing hard, his knuckles bruised. "He's one of Derek's," he said, voice tight. "Hired muscle, it's over." The cops confirmed it. Derek's call traced, the man linked to him, a violation of his parole. "He's not getting out," the officer said, and Naomi exhaled, the last thread of fear snapping. Julian pulled her close, Arya between them, and she felt the storm pass, leaving quiet in its wake. The wedding came a month later, small but perfect. The diner was transformed, tables pushed aside, fairy lights strung, flowers Arya picked from the yard in vases. Naomi wore a simple dress, white with lace, her hands trembling as Trish pinned a veil in her hair. "You're glowing," Trish said, grinning, and Naomi laughed, nerves and joy tangling inside her. Julian waited at the end of a makeshift aisle, Arya beside him in a starry dress, her basket of petals half spilled already. Friends gathered, diner regulars, Julian's assistant Marcus, a handful of Naomi's old co-workers, cheering as she walked to him, her heart pounding. He took her hands, his eyes soft, and the officiant's words blurred into a hum until Julian spoke. "I promise you everything," he said, his voice steady. "You and Arya, you're my world. I'll fight for you, love you, every day." Tears pricked her eyes, and she squeezed his hands, her own vows spilling out. "I was scared to let you in," she said, her voice breaking. "But you showed me what love is. I promise to trust you, to build this with you." Arya giggled, tossing petals at their feet, and the crowd laughed, the moment light and real. They kissed, long and deep, as cheers erupted, Arya clapping loudest. The reception was chaos, cake smeared on faces, dancing to a jukebox, Arya twirling until she collapsed in Julian's arms. Naomi watched, her heart full, the past a distant memory. That night, as guests drifted home, they stood on the diner's porch, Arya asleep inside. "We did it," Julian said, his arm around her, the ring on her finger glinting. "Yeah," she said, leaning into him. "We did." They shared a heartfelt embrace, the future stretching out, messy, beautiful, theirs. Derek was gone, the fear was gone, and in their place was love, hard-won and unshakable. The months after were a slow bloom. Julian scaled back his business, delegating to spend mornings with Arya, teaching her to ride a bike in the yard. Naomi cut her diner shifts, training a new girl to take over, dreaming of a catering side gig with Julian's encouragement. They fought sometimes over paint colors, Arya's bedtime, but made up fast, their love a steady current beneath it all. One spring day, they took Arya to the park, the same spot he'd proposed. She ran ahead, chasing butterflies, and Julian pulled Naomi to the gazebo, now weathered but still strung with lights. "Remember this?" he asked, grinning. "How could I forget?" she said, laughing as he spun her, a dance with no music but their own. Arya joined, tugging them into a circle, and they collapsed on the grass, breathless, a family in every way that mattered. Years later, Naomi would tell the story, on anniversaries to Arya as she grew, how a waitress and a billionaire found each other, fought for each other, built a life from scraps and scars. The lesson, she'd say, was simple. Love wasn't luck or fate, it was choice, every day through the dark and the light. And as she looked at Julian, gray creeping into his hair, Arya tall and bold beside him, she knew they'd chosen well. What lesson did you take from this story? Comment your thoughts below. Thank you for being part of this journey, my beautiful story family. If you loved this story, please like, share, and subscribe for more amazing content. Until next time, stay kind, stay humble, and stay loving.